your 25 years working in Panama, what was one of the most surprising discoveries that you had?
Surprising discoveries. Well, let me think. We have this one tree that Robin studied, if you know about Tachigali.
The suicidal tree.
Yeah. That the tropics have been there, and large parts of them have been wet and warm for 200, as long as there have been angiosperms, 200 million years. Whereas here and other areas, as you get out of the tropics, it's either turned dry or it's turned cold often. And most of those species are fully different. They're not like hidden species that you need an expert. They've got different sized leaves, they've got compound leaves, many of them are very similar.
I'm here today with Dr. Richard Condit, former director of the Center for Forest Science at the Smithsonian Institution. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Paul.
It's a pleasure to have you.
Okay, thanks.
I wanted to ask you first, to begin with, what started the spark or your interest in biology?
When I was a little kid, I liked whales. I got fascinated with whales. I drew them all the time. We had an Encyclopedia Britannica, and not long ago when we had to get rid of all my parents' books, I found the cetacean page and it was torn and taped, and I had looked at the pictures of whales in the Encyclopedia Britannica over and over again. That's where it started. But my dad taught history of science, so I grew up learning about Newton's law of cooling and experiments on pumping hearts by Harvey from sitting at the dinner table. So my dad was not a scientist, but he taught history of science, and he was fascinated by that period of science prior to the 20th century, I'd say.
What do you think drew you to whales? Growing up in the Midwest, we don't really have access to whales, unfortunately.
Must have been pictures, because I never saw one until I was much older. And I didn't see the ocean until I was a kid, 9 years old or so. So why? I must have seen a picture and thought it was interesting.
Maybe you could take us through your career as a biologist, because it's been quite varied. You started with satin Bowerbirds in Australia, and from there you went to genetics with bacteria.
Okay, so first of all, I was interested in wildlife. I called it wildlife when I was a teenager and looking for colleges, and I went to University of Illinois as a fallback, sort of. It was the easy place to go. And I met Mary Wilson there, and she said right away, you don't call it wildlife biology. She taught ecology and evolutionary biology. So I ended up working on a project with her in the forests near Champaign, Urbana, Illinois, catching birds, netting birds, and seeing where they like to fly in the fall when they were eating berries. So, but I was planning to be a marine biologist. I just went to the University of Illinois. So then I applied to graduate schools that had marine biology. So that's when I got into UC Santa Cruz, and they had a real famous biologist named Ken Norris. He studied whales, one of the prominent whale biologists in the world. But he didn't have room in his lab, so I joined the elephant seal lab. So that was
with Bernie.
Yeah, Bernie LeBeuf and Leo Ortiz, they were my co-advisors. Leo accepted me. I had money from NSF as a pre-doctoral award, so I had funding, and they took me in, and I started work on elephant seals. And they were both very, let me pick my way, so I was interested in, Leo was a physiologist, but that wasn't my strong point. But I did some I was interested in, I asked, well, what do they eat? Because we didn't know anything about what they eat. So I started working on figuring out what they ate and where they went. And so that led to I've worked with elephant seals now most of the time since. But after I finished there, so that's when I worked with Bowerbirds, and I needed a postdoc. At the time, it's still largely true, is you don't go to get you don't even apply for professorships after you have a PhD, and I certainly was not in a position to. So I was looking for postdocs. I didn't think I wanted to stay in marine mammals, and there are very few opportunities. So this guy, Jerry Borgia, he wanted someone to run a field group in Australia watching satin bowerbirds. And Jerry had a long-term project there. That was 1984, and I had been doing the same thing in Santa Cruz. I'd been observing elephant seals and also managing a field team who were responsible for collecting the data. So I went there, and it was the fall of '84, the spring of '84 down there, and spent 5 months in the forest at a place called Wallaby Creek, where Jerry, he had mapped out all the bowers, and the birds had tags, bands, colored bands, so they were known. So I had a route. There was 5 bowers that I visited every day, every day, twice a day, for 4 months. I still remember. The funny thing is, I went back there about 3 or 4 years ago. Was it 2020, 2019, 5 years ago? And I thought, surely I'll be able to find this route, because I walked every day, twice a day, up this hill to the top of a little waterfalls.
Yeah.
And that was the topmost bower. But everything was different, you know. The odd thing is that forests change, you know. Things that were forested all different, and I couldn't find where I was. I really didn't look the same. But there's a family there, and they're renting out a little shack as B&B, and I stayed up there with my wife. It's a fantastic spot. There's wallabies, tame wallabies and kangaroos that just stand there on the trail watching you, and sulfur-crested cockatoos and crimson rosellas. The bowerbirds are really fascinating birds. I mean, I could tell various stories about how they destroy each other's bowers. So the males are competing for attracting females, and they have to get decorations. The females are looking for decorations. Just a bizarre,
Yeah.
So it's an animal that builds this little hut just to attract females and then decorates it, which obvious attraction to some biologists.
With shiny blue objects, typically,
Well,
right?
they like blue, so sort of it's a dark blue. So they take Bic pens. They would take plastic things, but then they'd also use yellow flowers and yellow leaves. They'd take yellow acacia leaves and put them down on the bower, and then put purple flowers on top of them. And then the females sat inside the bower. They came in and stood there and watched the male court. Just bizarre. And then, the female will reach over and she'll bite the sticks. So we call that tasting. It's like she was tasting the bower.
Yeah.
And when he decorated the bower, he would pick up needles of this pine, which is a Norfolk Island pine, and he'd crush them with his beak, and he'd get this sort of like black stuff around his beak, and then he'd walk in the bower, and he'd wipe his beak along the sticks. We called that painting. So the males went in and painted the bower with their beaks, and then the females tasted it. You can figure out what's going on there.
Yeah.
But they wrecked each other's bowers. So a male would come, and I'd watch. Every day we'd watch one bower. So I'd sit for 6 hours every morning on one of the 5 bowers, and I watched them get destroyed. A male would come in while the owner's away, and he'd just pulled up all the sticks, and then they'd rebuild it in 45 minutes. They'd have this little bower.
Yeah.
It was really crude. But the really good males, the experienced ones, didn't get them wrecked very often, and their bowers got very firm and stiff and well shaped. But then the young males, they weren't very good, and the males, they were just like a few sticks in the ground.
Yeah.
And it happened, the way that worked is if an experienced male who didn't get his bower wrecked very often could develop it into a very well-modeled piece of art, let's say. Whereas the young ones, they get erect over and over, and all they had were a few sticks in the ground.
And for those people that don't know, the bower was typically like an arch, right? That a bower would be.
Not exactly. There's
shaded.
various species, and some of them are more elaborate. But the satin bowerbird, there's 2 walls about that far apart, and they don't contact each other. They're separate walls. And the inside of the wall is very, the sticks are they just stick the sticks in the ground, but they'll weave them together. They're just birds. They just take a stick and stick it in, but a third stick can go between 2. And then, so on the inside of the bower, and if they spend weeks at it and it hasn't been destroyed, it'll have a very smooth, curved shape like that. The outside is more ragged, and they're about that tall.
Oh, I thought they'd be much shorter.
And then in front of the bower, so there's very clear front and back, There's a front, which is we call it a platform, where the bird just lays sticks. All the sticks are about 1 millimeter, similar size, and maybe a foot long. Just lay many, many sticks on top of each other, and then on top of those there'd be decorations.
That's where the blue objects and the flowers would be then.
Yeah. So they'd it would often be sort of a background of yellow leaves, which were acacia leaves, and they picked snail shells, which was odd. So there'd be snail shells. And then they like blue flowers, and then there's a parrot there called a crimson rosella, and it has bright blue, really not bright, dark royal blue flight feathers. So crimson rosella feathers about 14 inches long, deep royal blue, and the birds loved those. They were the prime. And the reason you can tell what they love is that they steal each other's decorations. So actually, Jerry had never done this. I said, let's number them. So on the snail shells, we'd get a little marking pen, we'd put a little number. And then on the feathers, we took a tiny piece of adhesive tape and then wrote a number on it, just big enough to write a little number, and stick it on the inside vein. Then we could track the feathers around. So there was these rosella feathers. A beautiful one would show up and it would bounce around through bowers over the next couple days. They just steal them from each other. So the more experienced birds, and they lived a long time, so some of these bowers had been there 10 years or more. Same spot, same bower, the same bird. They were better at getting decorations and preventing other males from stealing them, so they'd have more feathers and blue flowers. And we don't really know about snail shells. They're kind of white, brown, empty snail shells, and they like putting those on the bowers. And we had hundreds numbered, and they'd get stolen and moved around too. So the females are evidently, so then the female, she arrives, and she enters the bower facing the platform. And the male at that time courts. He walks around and he carries things in his beak, and then he makes this grating, this peculiar grating, which he only makes when he's courting. It's like a song, but it sounds like a wind-up something. It's a strange. And
do the males do a dance in that
sort
area
of a
too?
dance. I mean, that's what he's doing. He's kind of marching around.
Yeah.
But he lifts his wings up and bends over, so his head's down close to the ground, and makes this strange grating sound. But he moves around. You might call it a dance. It's like a strut. And the female watches, and sometimes she just leaves, and then sometimes she mates. And Jerry was had a big investment in. We had cameras. We had to keep changing the film, so we knew every time a female came and who she was and whether she mated. And Jerry was getting the background on when they mated and who they mated with and why.
But the females would come and evaluate the bower as he was constructing it too.
No, she's not watching.
No. She would
Well,
only
we don't
come
know
after.
for sure where she is when she's not there, but it looked to me like she comes, she's in the bower, it's very quick.
Yeah.
The whole thing's over in a minute or two, and often she just left without mating. Sometimes really fast, just a few seconds. And then they mate inside the bower. So the male will scoot around, climb on top of her, and they're mate. So she's evident, the background is these birds have been watched by European scientists for 100 years. The female's got nothing to go on except standing at this bower and watching the decorations and the dance and seeing the bower, which she tastes.
Yeah.
Tasting the bower, looking at the decoration. He doesn't feed her. He doesn't feed the young. He never goes to the nest. So it's this extreme of the peacock-like trait. The female gets nothing from the male, and all she knows about him is this visit to the bower. And Jerry knew, I think females, sure enough, they visited 8 bowers nearby, and they probably, visited several and then picked the one they liked on the basis of the taste and the decorations.
Yeah. But you could discern differences in the decorations and the construction of the bower from bower to bower.
I knew which ones were good.
Yeah.
So the RKY was the first one. I think it was WGW, white, green, white, and black, red, black, yellow. They were both old males, had been there for a long time, and their bowers I saw one of them destroy the other once, but generally they weren't destroyed very much. Then the one at the top of the root, I had to go all the way up to Hill. I don't remember who he was. But he was a younger guy, and his power wasn't nearly as good quality. And, so Jerry's, I think, even before Jerry, the general theory is that the dominant males, possibly better genes, they're the ones that are better able at getting decorations and maintaining a good bower. And that's what the females are looking for. And the young guys, or even if it's an older male, but who's not good at competing with the other males, she's looking at the bower as an indication. I mean, that's the theory. It's hard to know that for sure. And, a lot of animals do this. Elephant seals, it's not real obvious how the female decides who to mate. She more or less takes the biggest male who's there. And the young ones will get chased away by the big males, and the females don't like the young males. They'll get away from them if they can. So, the female elephant seals are evidently judging a partner by the one who can, beat the shit out of the other males and stay in the center of the beach.
And where does the evolutionary genetics of bacteria fall into this?
Okay, so that was a fluke again. I wanted jobs in these fields. There are not that many jobs. So, honestly, I worked on elephant seals hoping to work on dolphins. It was great. I mean, the thing I like about elephant seals in retrospect is we can watch lifetimes of the same animals, which is very difficult to do in dolphins. But I didn't think I'd be able to work in marine mammals. There were very few postdocs. I finished the postdoc with birds, Bowerbirds, and this guy, Bruce Levin, he needed a postdoc, and he's an evolutionary geneticist, and he's, completely interested only in bacterial evolution and why different traits evolve. Nothing like, the run-of-the-mill microbiologist who looks at biochemistry, the genes and how the genes work and things. And so Bruce said that, so I found his advertisement, and he said he wanted someone doing evolution of bacteria. And he said afterwards that he got 11 applications, 10, he called them gel jocks. 10 fellows who'd been working in a lab running gels to sequence DNA or, proteins. And I was the only one who had a background in evolution and things. So Bruce invited me to go there. So I worked in a lab growing bacteria. That was a big change. But I still, to me, I like populations and numbers. And this was you get a lot of counts, see how many bacteria there are, and you can count very precisely, watch them evolve, traits like antibiotic resistance and how it changes. And in 4 days, I can watch a gene move from one to another.
And then from there you went to tropical rainforests.
But that's where I learned, so I got this background in gel. I did a little bit of DNA. Well, no, I didn't sequence DNA there, but I looked at plasmids, gels, to identify plasmids. But I was still interested in doing field work again, being in natural populations, what I called wildlife when I was a teenager. And Steve Hubble needed someone at that time to work in Panama. And he wanted someone who could run the lab because he wanted to do DNA of trees, but also associated with the field work in the forest in Panama, which was the 50-hectare plot, just like the one in Ecuador. So that's when I started there, and I did the genetics for a while, but the whole point was to associate it with the population. So I was in the forest and, using the data to map out where the trees are. And so I started off by collecting, every adult of viral sabifera to do the genetics of it, and another species, Piper reticulatum, and I had to have the maps, which we could do from the census. So, the 50-hectare plot has every tree mapped. So we know the location of every adult, can go right back to them over and over.
And that forest plot in Barrow, Colorado Island, that's the longest monitored forest plot in the world, is that correct? Or?
No, it's the longest, not if you include every plot, because it's the longest large plot.
Largest 50 hectare.
Yeah. I mean, Puerto Rico, they did a couple plots in the 30s, I think, and I think some of those have been followed.
They have been recensus?
Yeah, well, definitely they were for a long time. I'm not sure whether they have been lately, but probably. They were, but very small plots, probably 1 hectare, and they're tropical.
Yeah.
I mean, if you go to Europe or the United States, you can find cases where tree plots have been tracked for many decades. There were some in Costa Rica started up in the 70s that I think people have gotten back to. So they're up around 50 years. But the BCI, the Barrow, Colorado plot was started in 1980, and they got it fully census in 82. But that's 50 hectares, and that's more than 10 times larger than previous plots. So by far the largest plot, and now it's been over 50 years. So it's the oldest of the large plots.
How often do they recensus that plot?
5 years
Every
is the
5 years.
plan, but then it was not recensused in 2020 because of the COVID. So actually started and then shut it down. And so 2020 was skipped. So this program all over the world, that's what I helped get going, was to spread that idea so we could get comparisons. And Steve Hubble and Robin Foster started that plot in Panama.
And those protocols that you guys started, are those still used today when establishing new forest plots?
Yeah, they are. I wrote a book that documented them all, and by and large, my book I was very thorough about writing down the details, and many people use it regularly. In fact, I've written quite a few scientific articles, but that book is now being cited more and more as my most frequent citation because it's used everywhere to describe the methods.
Yeah. So that is the gold standard, if you will.
Yeah, I like this story that my own ego is there was a group in Wisconsin that started one, Bob Howe, and they set up a plot. I was up there a couple times. It's up in northern Wisconsin. And I was out in the field with them, and they told me that if they got to a tree and they weren't sure how to measure it, they weren't quite sure because it was a little bit shaped oddly or something, and they would say, well, what would Condit do? That's what they told me, they said.
Yeah.
Now things have changed, and you got to improve methods. So there are some things that I do different now since I wrote it down. So, and then there's some updates. So,
in your 25 years working in Panama, what was one of the most surprising discoveries that you had during your time there?
Surprising discoveries. Well, let me think. It was. A lot of them are details that, we have this one tree that Robin studied, if you know about Tachigali.
The suicidal tree.
Yeah. So, I watched that over and over again, and because sure enough, he always said it happened every 4 or 5 years. It's not clear if that's a real pattern, but they always die, they flower and die. So I saw that several occasions. There was one right next to the trail, and walked past it for years, and then once it flowered, and then next time I was past it, it was dying, and then it was dead, and then the trunk had fallen. Then there's there's another tree called a guaiacon. Its scientific name is now changed, Handroanthus guaiacon, but it's a giant tree. It has bright yellow flowers, but the wood is peculiarly hard and resistant. So there was one. Some of them are still standing in the lake. So they flooded the lake in 1910, Gatun Lake around Barrow, Colorado Island. And what happens is the trees all rot then approximately to water level because the trunks are all down there. You go around in a boat and the trunks are all down there still. The whole forest is there, but they're all broken below the water level. So when the water gets really low, you saw these trunks sticking up. That happened in 97. But here's the guaiacon. It doesn't rot, so it's still standing there, and there's still some of the trees. So we had one that Robin told us died in the 30s, the 1930s, and I used to walk by this tree for years and years, and it finally fell over. It fell over in the late 90s, so it took 60 years for this tree after it died to fall over. And then it lay across the trail, and there's game wardens who are supposed to clear the trail with a big saw, but he couldn't cut this. It's about this big around laying across the trail, and it's just, this tree it had died 80 years earlier. It just felt like solid wood, really hard. So it just lay there across the trail for months because the
no way to cut
fellows who couldn't cut through it with the regular saw.
But going back to the to the suicidal tree, what is the theory as to why that a tree with such a life cycle would evolve like that?
Yeah, well, so what I found out about it after watching many trees for years is that it grows slowly when it's small. So it starts off with these little saplings and they last a long time. And but when it gets to be about, half a meter, 2 feet around, it sprouts and it grows enormously rapidly. And so when I looked carefully and looked at growth rates, sure enough, of all the trees in the forest, once they're big trees, once they're half a meter or a meter in diameter, it's the very fastest growing. So what it's done is it withholds from reproduction and grows enormously rapidly. And so I think, so I have these examples of trees that were, they went from, during our time of measuring them in 25 years, they went from, this big, I don't remember the exact numbers, to this big. So trees, they get up there in the canopy in the light and they grow really fast. And then I discovered that the second fastest growing is another same family, Fabaceae prioria, which also waits a really long time to reproduce. And it grows really fast. So it starts out very, very slow, and then it reaches this medium size and then sprouts to a giant tree. So they're both withholding reproduction and growing really fast to generate gigantic crowns. But the big difference between them is that prioria then keeps doing that, and it lives a long time. So they're completely opposite. They're related trees with a similar pattern, but one of them now dies immediately and the other one keeps growing. So it's a very extreme difference. But we've tried really hard to, Tachigalia must take advantage of that by producing a vast number of seeds. So we've tried to find that, but they reproduce so seldom, because only tree reproduces and dies. So you can't go out and find a Tachigalia. That one reproduced last year, like prioria, the other one. They reproduce year after year. You can watch them reproduce. But so during the entire 25 years, now Joe Wright, he counts all the seeds as they fall. So, there's only been a few years where any Tachigalia fell. So they must be producing very large numbers of seeds. And then, so when they die, then they flood the forest with these seeds. But we haven't been able to pin that down because we haven't been able to find.
Approximately how many years does it take for one to get to that 1 meter size?
So I just published all that. So, and I don't remember. I have numbers in a table. It probably takes 100 years for a prioria, which is normal for a lot of the trees. 100 years to reach a size where we'd say it's just getting to the canopy, so it's tall enough, it's half a meter, maybe 30 centimeters, 1 foot, and then its leaves are reaching all the way up near the canopy so it can get full light. And that's probably taking 100 years. Some of the species were 150 years, so prioria is slow, so I think it's more like 150 years. But then it grows fast, so it goes from that to very big size, 20 years. And Tachigalia, I think it's extraordinary. Once it reaches just getting into the canopy, a foot and a half, 10 or 20 years, it's then a giant tree.
Are those two species considered pioneer species?
No.
They don't need a lot of light then?
No, they both survive in the shade. So prioria, especially, very large number of saplings in the shade. So that distinction is weedy tree. We call them pioneers. They'll only grow in the sun, so they require clearings or roadsides. In the forest, they'll grow in tree falls, where a tree falls and then there's sun reaching the ground. Tree fall gaps. Quite a few species. It's a minority of species, but there's a group that rely on those, and they'll suddenly grow up really rapidly in those tree fall gaps. Cecropia is the classic one, and it's very common, fairly common. So in the shade, you never see young Cecropia. And in these clearings, you find a big clearing and there's a whole stand of young Cecropia. But prioria is completely different. You walk through the shaded understory, there's prioria everywhere. You get into the gap, there's still a couple prioria. They don't even appear to respond to the gap. They're there, They will grow faster, but they'll survive in the shade for a long time. And Tachigali does too. So they're both they're both living in the shade for a long time. But then, they get out of the shade by growing tall. So every species gets to do that, and every species eventually not every. Big trees eventually rely on getting up there into the sun. Then they produce a lot of leaves, and they can grow a lot and generate a lot of fruit. Now some species don't. The ones in the understory, they're little trees, small plants, and they just never escape into the sun. They have to live in dense shade. They can never grow much, and they don't produce many fruits. But there's a whole group of species that do that. I just finished working on seedlings and seeds because Joe started counting seeds in seed traps, it started in Yosemite. Mm-hmm. Margaret Metz has been doing it there with Nancy Garwood and Joe Wright. And so Joe's now been following seeds. He catches a seedling when it first comes out of the ground. And he's been doing that for 25 years now. So I got a hold of all his data, and I said, we've always wanted to do this, but I counted them all up, and I've tracked, Joe's been doing all the work, tracking a seed all the way up to reaching a sapling stage. So we have, over 25 years, I've got some really fast growing trees that started out 1 centimeter, my finger, that are already big trees.
Yeah.
And we've got seeds that started out germinating in the ground that are now up to about 3 or 4 meters tall. So still a long way from a seed all the way to an adult. But I pieced it all together, so I know how long it takes, and I know that most of the species will finish a cycle, their entire lives, in about 150 years, but anywhere from 100 up to 300. And it doesn't sound very long because trees can live so much longer, but those are averages. It's like,
sure.
It would be the same as what's the mean lifespan of humans. Well, you'll hear 80 years or something. That doesn't mean that some people don't live. We have 110, 120-year-old people, but the average lifespan of the trees is between 100 and 300. And it takes the seeds the average is 20 years to reach just a centimeter. And it takes 150 years for the 1 centimeter to reach an adult. So we know for sure that I'm not going to watch. It could happen in these really fast-growing ones, but there's not very many of them. So Treem is the one that grew from a centimeter to 40 centimeters in 20 years, I think. We watched that happen. But, I've spent some time with Tachigali trying to see, how many individuals do I need? Could I piece together a full lifetime? Because Kaoru Kitajima, a Japanese woman, she knew of Tachigali seeds that she saw them germinate that were 1.5 meters tall after 20 years. And so I discovered that I could find a Tachigali that was about 1.5 meters that made it to 20 centimeters while I've been watching. And I can find a Tachigali that's 20 centimeters that made it to adulthood while I've been watching. So I got 3 different pieces that I can watch. So then you could say it could do it in 60 years, so that would be the very fastest. Mm-hmm. A Tachigali could make it from a seed to a big tree in 60 years.
Why should someone care about tropical rainforests? Just someone in the general public. What do you think is the most important thing that we could communicate to people that don't study science about tropical rainforests?
Okay, yeah, that's a tough one. I think that if I answered the question, what if I get engaged with someone and they ask me about it, usually the things they like hearing about is how many species there are. So in other words, what's interesting, so I might say, well, what's interesting to people? That's not often what gets funding, if you can cure a disease or something, or say you're saving the planet. I've never been very good about that. But people are interested in the high number of species. So people are interested in that plot in Yosemite has more species of trees than all of North America. And those are fully good species. They all look different. Not quite all. How many can you tell apart in Yosemite?
In the day down to family level.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but most of those species are fully different.
Mm-hmm.
They're not like hidden species that you need an expert. I mean, they've got different sized leaves, they got compound leaves, many of them are very similar. There's groups that are similar. But Inga has 44 species, I think, in Yosemite. They all look different. They got 4 leaflets, they got 8 leaflets, they got big leaflets, they got small leaflets. There's 1,000 species there, and that's more than the entire continent of North America. And those are species that you lay them out on the table, you could see they're different species. So that number of species is pretty impressive. And then if you ask about, I don't think no one even has any idea how many insect species are there. The number of insect species in that forest is, some of the estimates are really high, but I don't think anyone really knows. And many of them have not described.
Right. Well, even tree species, right?
Well, some tree species are still being described, but for insect species, it's probably the majority of them haven't even been looked at,
right,
let alone described. And then there's bacteria too and things. So I think those features are those are really, a lot of people get interested in that. Because, I'm telling you about lifespan. That's pretty normal for a tree lifespan. I mean, in many ways, the forest is a lot like a forest here in Illinois. The trees probably live about the same amount of time. They grow somewhat faster there. It's wetter, it's warmer, so they grow faster. There's about the same number of species in a hectare. Same number of trees in a hectare. So in many ways, it just looks like a run-of-the-mill forest. So it's really, the species is so different. And of course, the animals are fascinating.
Mm-hmm. For people that don't really understand, why is species diversity so high in tropical rainforests?
Yeah, that's a great question we like to argue about. I mean, I think one important aspect is that up here, we've gone through ice ages for a lot of the past. So this is one line of thinking, that the tropics have been there, and large parts of them have been wet and warm for as long as there have been angiosperms, 200 million years. Whereas here and other areas, as you get out of the tropics, it's either turned dry or it's turned cold often, where often means every few thousand years. And so that's the sort of cradle that if we were able to keep North America exactly as it is for the next 100 million years, then I think we would find thousands of tree species here. But the glaciers and then as you get near deserts, you have the same phenomenon. So you're at the edge of a dry, so the tropics are wet, and then there's a band of dry. And that band of dry, so in that area, the wet expands and it's wet, and then the wet contracts and it's dry. So you're alternating wet and dry, which is a really big difference to plants. Plants need water. If they don't have water, then they have very special adaptations to conserve water. But down there in the middle of the tropics, there's this band where it's been warm and it's been wet nearly all the time for millions, tens of millions of years. So that's one line of thinking. I think that's the most convincing, the firmest way of something that's... So the other idea that's the widespread one is that I think that you might put it as diversity begets diversity. So the fact that there's been a lot of plants fosters a lot of insects, because every plant is different. So insects that specialize on different plants are different. And then that's a feedback. Well, so it fosters bacteria, which also foster plants. So there's a positive feedback. Many of those come out as ecological hypotheses. You have more species of fungi, you have more species of insects. All of those tend to favor more species of trees. And there's a bunch of hypotheses about that. I mean, when it's usually stated, it's just a circular argument, because you say, where does it come from? So you have to have, I think it has to begin with this geological, what would you call it, geological, long-term historical explanation, and then diversity, fostering diversity, begetting diversity. And that's what, these Jansen-Connell hypotheses, they hinge on having, that hypothesis that there's a lot of pests, and that the pests are specialized, therefore that favors a lot of trees. Well, why are there a lot of pests? You're just begging the question. So somewhere in there you need to originate the high species richness. So that's why I think you can get that with the climatic type argument.
The most
It's kind of
accepted
steep.
theory, or no?
I think they're both certainly widely accepted and widely known. I think people would come down different. I'm pretty sure there's some people who firmly think it's all in the present, that the warmer, wetter climate now favors, and then others I think would have the stronger historical. So I think I'm probably more in the historical camp than some people. So, those are a broad division that both can be true, I think. Both are. So, there's many details of those hypotheses, I think. Most of them would be details on temperature, for example. Just because it's warmer, that populations are higher. Because it's warmer, it's more productive. And that higher populations can lead to more species. That by itself doesn't seem very convincing to me. Because, the populations might be higher, but I was just saying the forest, number of trees in a hectare is about the same. Even in Canada as Panama, it's a little bit different, but not that different.
Mm-hmm. What has been the impact of climate change on tropical rainforests?
Good one. The interesting thing is that if you do look at the maps and you talk to most people, the tropics are relatively less affected than the real warming areas are way out in the Arctic. And so in my time in Panama, I was studying climate, I couldn't see that the rainfall was changing, and I couldn't see that the temperature was changing. And there's a few articles, but over 30 years, and then the rainfall data go back 100 years. There was no long-term change in rainfall.
Not that you noticed in Panama.
Yeah, so going 100 years, there hasn't been. The temperature records aren't that good. They're only about 50 years. Mm-hmm. But, Helena Mueller-Landau, she did it very thoroughly about 10 years ago, and there was no obvious temperature change. So, I think I wrote some things about how, because we had it was very dry in the late 80s. I've written a later paper about that and noticed that it was dry in the late 80s, but that didn't last. It got wet again, and it looks to me like there was a period where it was dry in the late 70s into the late 80s in Panama. But then from 1990 to 2015, none of these droughts happened again, and it was fairly wet. So I think we saw, when the plot began, a signal of this dry period where certain species didn't do very well, and a lot of species recruitment dropped, but it didn't persist. And so at the time I thought, well, this could be a drying, but that didn't seem to hold. It hasn't held up as far as I know. I don't know that much about the ocean, so
What have you noticed is the most surprising difference between temperate forests compared to tropical rainforests?
Well, definitely diversity. So I like if you see an aerial picture and it's in color, you can see in a moment that a temperate forest is one tree species or two. It's often just one. They're all the same color, same exact shade of green. And then a tropical rainforest, same image, same sun, and then there's 50 different shades of green alternating, and that's obvious to me now. You've probably seen it, and
yeah.
You can see in TV shows. Where was that filmed? Well, you can see at a glance whether it's diverse. So that's one. The lianas are conspicuous, and epiphytes. So mature tropical forests, I was going to say nearly always have big lianas, and they can be really big. You get in the southern U.S., there's poison ivy. Sometimes poison ivy is pretty big, but the diversity of really big lianas, very different. And then the epiphytes, you look up in the crown of a tree and anywhere in Yasuni and Barrow, Colorado, and you might know the ceiba. The ceiba has big flat branches, and they're just covered. The horizontal branch is just a little forest of epiphytes, and there might be 100 species of epiphytes in there, a solid layer. They like the horizontal branches. Peter Ashton used to tell me that he thinks that in Southeast Asia there's fewer epiphytes. That would be a generalization, that it's because the dipterocarps, which are very abundant, tend to grow, their branches grow up more vertically, whereas Seba, and that's the Bombaceae. There's several families that have more horizontal branching, attractive to epiphytes. That's an interesting split, though, that the epiphytes are really more numerous in the American tropics. There's quite a few in Africa, though. I've been there in Africa.
That is interesting, yeah.
Uh-huh. I mean, there's other differences the way a mature wet forest, the understory can be so dense for large areas. Whereas here, there's lots of forests I walk into around northeastern United States, and it looks like a park. It looks like there's no understory. You can just walk through the forest. There's big trees and you can see that in Chicago in the oak woodlands. They call them oak savannas at the extreme. Mm-hmm. That's in Yosemite. The understory is so dense. Yeah. Many places if you don't have a trail cut, it's difficult walking. That's partly moisture and partly diversity. There's species that live in that shaded understory. There's places where the palms, in Brazil, I remember Manaus, there's an astracarium or something, and it just covers the understory. Practically the entire understory for large areas is this one, it's a tiny acaulescent palm, has no trunk, just the leaves sticking out of the ground, giant leaves, just covering the understory, which is completely different from anything around here. And primates.
That's a big one, yeah.
What are there, 11 species at Yosemite? Is that the number?
At least.
You said 11 species.
I think it might be more, yeah. There's quite a few.
The big birds, which is, one of the sort of circles was that you got big birds, and then so the trees produce big fruits. So here's a diversity fostering mechanism. You bring in the big birds like toucans or hornbills or trogons, and then the trees, you get new species of trees that produce big fruits, which then attracts big birds. So which came first?
I had the harpy eagle too, right?
Yeah.
And that.
We had one in Panama for a while. The peregrine friend let one go, and did you know about that?
No.
So these birds had transmitters and they were banded, and they would go out and catch them if they had to. So they were semi-tame birds. They were hunting on their own, and they killed sloths, iguanas. They killed some howler monkeys, but they watched one bird all year, and it had 52 kills. So they knew it was killing once a week or so, and they knew every kill, and they watched many of them. So I went out once. I knew the woman who was doing it, and we followed one around. So it's got a transmitter. She knew where it was. We walked up, and we watched it on a branch for probably 4 hours. Just stood there, and the bird just sat there and turned its head. And it didn't kill that day. She could tell after, if it had been 5 days since it killed, that it would get hungry, and I never saw it kill. They watched it kill animals on the ground. They'd never seen a harpy eagle do that. It attacked an animal on the ground. It was a peccary, I think a young baby peccary. They would get sloths where the bird would get its claws in the back of a sloth, and the sloth would wrap its arms around the branch, and the bird would hang there, flapping its wings, pulling the sloth off. And the monkeys apparently learned, I think. So the howler monkeys figured out that this animal was... So I think it killed some howler monkeys, and fewer after that. The howler monkeys wised up. But then they took it back. It was a temporary. One of them died. It left the island, and it got shot.
But when they would hunt on the ground, that would be in a clearing where a tree had fallen?
Well, it was up in the trees, and it just attacked a peccary on the ground. But what it did, no one had ever seen this before, it hit the peccary with its claws and knocked it, and then returned and got on top of it. So I don't know, golden eagles must do that, but yeah. I always saw harpy eagles hunted in the trees, but this one attacked a young peccary on the ground.
But there was a clearing in the forest?
Yeah, there was a place where there's an opening where it saw the peccary move. Parts of the Barrow, Colorado forest, there are places where it's open, you can see.
Sure.
It's less, like Yosemite is denser than Barrow, Colorado. More of fewer areas in Yosemite where you can see more than 20 meters and
Yeah.
where there's much of an opening. Bear, Colorado has some more open spots
Yeah.
mixed in. I think it's just the moisture, the wetter areas, the more undergrowth builds up understory.
What role do forests in general play in mitigating climate change?
Well, they store carbon, so they keep carbon out of the atmosphere. So there's two ways that works. Anything that's not a forest now, if it's converted to a forest, then that's taking carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it in the trees. So when forests regrow on non-forested land. But the other aspect is I think they're finding out, there's more and more research showing that old mature forests continue to sequester carbon. And that's immediately non-logical. The idea would be that once the forests reach a certain level of biomass, they get 30, 40, 50 meters tall, there's trees get big, but then they start dying at the same rate as they're growing, and you would reach an equilibrium amount of carbon. But I think what they're finding in quite a few cases now that some of that carbon gets down into the ground and never comes back out. So that would happen from roots. If a giant tree dies and the roots are underground, it might take a very long time for that carbon to ever be oxidized back into the atmosphere. And so when an old forest is cleared, at first you lose carbon. Well, let's say we're cleared and burned. When you burn it and all that carbon goes in the air, that's carbon dioxide, but there's still a lot of carbon in the ground, but that will slowly decay away and get lost into the atmosphere. But I think it's probably pretty widely observed that very old forests continue to take carbon out of the atmosphere. And that's why, that would be, for example, why is there coal? Coal is carbon that got in the ground 300 million years ago, and it's still there. So, I guess that's the source of climate change, is we're finally getting those trees out of the ground. So in that respect, small forest growing is to enlarge the forest would therefore extract carbon out of the atmosphere. But that requires either young forest growing taller or young forest germinating growing, medium forest growing taller. But any forest that's left will continue to take. So when it's asphalt and things, there's nothing to take carbon out of the atmosphere. But that's all, there is a carbon sink in North America. The forests are drawing carbon out, and most of that number is due to the forests are regrowing because North America was largely cleared. Not largely cleared, but many of the forests were cleared in the 1800s, 19th century, and have been gradually regrowing ever since. So, and that's still going on, and so that's, I think, the biggest piece of what the carbon sink. So North America is drawing carbon out of the atmosphere because the forests are regrowing.
What challenges have you faced studying these very different organisms, from marine mammals to tropical rainforests to birds?
Well, you're just asking a scientific question about what needs to be. The nice thing about trees is that we can follow one tree with fair certainty. They don't move around. You can put a little number on it to be sure you know which one it is. So we watch lifetimes of, so some of the limiting factors would be how many fruits they produce. So I would like to know, and I don't know if this will answer the question, but I would like to know how many fruits a tree produces. So I would like to go to every single tree in the forest and say that one has 18,000 fruits this year. That's been very difficult to get. So the only way, and Joe Wright's been doing this, is indirectly, or other people do it, is you put these traps out. They're just nylon mesh held up in a square by PVC off the ground, and you count fruits that fall in it. So based on that, I have a pretty good idea, Joe Wright and I, how many fruits the whole forest produces, but I don't know which trees they come from. you can sort of guess at it because we know where the traps are, we know where the adults are, but that's not very precise. So I have not been able to, that would close a loop, and Joe counts the fruit seeds hitting the traps, so I know how many are falling. And then once they germinate, he's been counting them as soon as they, well, every year, so they're definitely within a year. So as I mentioned earlier, I can piece together these 25-year observations of individuals that are marked, and I know for sure it's the same individual. But that stage where the adults produce fruits, I don't know how many. I don't know whether they're doing it every year. I mean an individual. Like, does every tree produce every year? And I don't see a good way of doing that. Otherwise, we would have done it. You can go, I mean, and people do go out and look at every individual tree, so you visually inspect trees. But it's too slow, and it's not very precise. So that's missing.
Could you briefly describe dominance hierarchies in elephant seals, transitioning back to
well, I was going to
elephant
say
seals?
that in the seals, sort of similar missing things. It's frustrating that in the seals, they don't hold still. They have numbers on them, but I can't be sure. And so we do have some that I can watch them their whole lifetimes. We have females that are 22 years old, and we've had some see them with a pup every single year. But unfortunately, they go missing. They lose their numbers, and there are these times when I think they're there, but no one saw them, so we missed them. Those are gaps. So it's sort of a gap there. So someone will figure out how to get rid of those gaps so we know the life of every single animal in seals. So a dominance hierarchy in seals. Well, that would be the males. Usually that would be where the answer comes from. And in many mammals, similar mammals, large mammals, the males are, they fight, and they literally fight physical brawls for access to females, where access often means the male who wins the fight gets to stand there, if it's a mountain goat or a deer, on the hillside where the females are. And in the seal, it'll sit on, the male that wins the fight will pick a spot on the beach near the females. I'm pretty sure in elephant seals and many other cases, the males are males are going to follow the females. They're waiting to mate. And in the elephant seals, the females pick the beach. They have a beach where they can have pups safely out of the surf on flat sandy beaches, but near the water. I mean, it's this little band. They don't walk very well. They're ocean animals. They can't go very far on land, but if they don't go far enough, then the waves can separate them from their pups. So they pick spots on the beach, and the males are fighting for those spots. If the females move over there, the males will just move over there. So the males are fighting amongst themselves to occupy spots near the females. There's no other reason to do it except to mate. I mean, there's nothing else they're getting out of it. There's no food there. So unlike deer and some of the other animals, they're not eating. The females don't eat on the beach. They got no reason to be there except to nurse their pup. The male's got no reason to be there except to mate with the female. Male has nothing to do with the pups. Now and then they hurt the pups by mistake, crushing them. So a dominance hierarchy would be the notion, which I think it works in seals. There's a group of males. I mean, there's about 100 males, but most of those are younger. So in a one beach where I've watched, there's 20 males that are big enough to possibly win a fight. And they fight very rarely. That's one of the themes. They fight early, so they start mating in December. That's when females arrive. The males get there in early December, and they'll fight very rarely. So I've only seen a handful in my life in early December, knockdown dragouts where two males will square off, and they'll for 45 minutes or more, and they're bloody. And
I saw some in Ano Nuevo.
Ano Nuevo,
Yeah.
That's where I've been working. But it's very rare. And then, so I think our thought is, our belief, Bernie Buff would say that many of the males a pair of males won't bother because one of the males doesn't think he has a chance. So they will settle on like an agreement, and that male's agreeing that he's subordinate, and he will avoid that dominant male, but he'll go to another part of the beach. And so you get a dominance hierarchy where if we're perfectly linear, there's one top one, and that male will move every male around. Now, this is what Bernie would have described it. So let's say there are 20 that are competing. It could be more than 20, but there could be an exact order, and those 20 know it, and they know each other. And we know they know each other because they do, Colleen Reichmuth, she does playbacks. You can tape a male and then play that back with speakers and watch other males respond. So they know who's who, just by the voice.
But don't they have sections
Yeah,
sections
so-
of their own beach?
So males are not,
harems?
so elephant seals are not territorial. There's no physical markers. Now sea lions are. So I watched a sea lion on Año Nuevo, the stellar sea lion it's called, and they occupy separate territories and they respect a boundary. And it's two males will threaten each other and they'll stop at a boundary. But the elephant seals don't do that. So the dominant male, and so Bernie, I watched alpha males. There's clearly one male who no other male will challenge him. If he moves towards a female, other males will back down. But at the one beach on the island, which is very big, and there's another one on the mainland you probably saw, they're so big that alpha male, so I remember watching and I thought of 3 alpha males, because they were 3 separate parts of the beach. They're about 40 yards between them, where they just didn't interact. There was no reason to interact. So they had occupied these sections, but they're not territorial and they won't stay there. And it doesn't always happen that one stays in one area. And I think, some of the years, I knew that one was alpha. He was the top of the hierarchy. And if he went down where the second male was, the second one would stay away from him. So in an ideal hierarchy, there's an ordering of every male. Now you'd get down into the young males, there's not an ordering probably. And the young males will just avoid any conflict with any bigger male. And they'll stay way out in the periphery. And they might have, once they get to know each other, there's probably pairs. Now an odd one, and I think this has been described, is you could have a triangular relationship where A dominates B, B dominates C, but C dominates A, so it doesn't have to be. I think in some species they've described that. So the hierarchy is not perfect.
Yeah.
That'd be mathematically, you'd call it transitive, I think, or something like that. So elephant seals, it's probably the top males. There's a group of males who have a hierarchy and they all know it, and they know each other, and they do not want to fight, so they will back down when they know they've already acknowledged it's, this one's dominant, and they're not going to go back. It's not worth getting back in a fight, so they stop fighting, and they seldom fight later in the season. That's the hierarchy.
What have you learned from your research on tropical trees, elephant seals, satin bowerbirds, that has informed something in your own life?
In my own life, I think I've come across that idea, but I don't know if I have anything offhand to give you. What have you learned?
Well, I haven't researched all those same organisms. Yeah. I think it's just maybe not informed, but just confirmed my love of science, my love of nature.
Well, I enjoy the scientific aspects of having numbers to work with. That's what I've always liked. So I'm working on projects where a lot of it is just numbers, piecing together numbers and knowing how many there are. Oddly, in both the case of the elephant seals and the bowerbirds, which I kind of fell into those, they were the real classic, masculine ones. So there's been these, when Bernie worked for about 10 years and then he had some female students who said, well, we should look at it from the female point of view. And I don't think I see myself as that sort of, both, like the elephant seals are very conspicuously violence oriented, and the males win by violence. And I don't think that's, isn't, and the Bowerbirds are, they're not violent, which is a quite different one. But they're competing, they steal from each other and things. But of course the female elephant seals are also violent, and they fight. They might have hierarchies, but nothing like males. I mean, two females close together probably have gotten to know each other. And the really ugly part is that sometimes an adult female will attack a pup who's trying to steal milk. So the pups try to steal milk when they lose their mothers, especially. And most females ignore them, which is a personality difference, which is a really interesting part of it. The females are quite different in personality, but some of the females lash out at pups trying to steal milk, and they'll grab a hold of the pup and throw it. And it really stands out because most females don't do that. Anyway, they got their violent sides too.
Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. I could go on for hours more, but I'll let
You have more questions. Well,
we could do a part 2 some other time.
Well, I end up, I'll start talking about the things I know about.
All right. Well, thank you.
Okay.